Hi Danny, Grace and Jude. This is how to manage aerobic or endurance exercise. So the types of activity we're thinking about is one-paced activities such as jogging, bike riding, walking, swimming, potentially rowing if you're going at one pace. Anything that is a constant use of energy and generally tends to drop the glucose level as represented here, here and here. So we've already discussed in the intro, but just worth revisiting. When you're doing these one-paced activities, your muscle cells have a side door open that sucks more glucose out of the blood, therefore the risk is dropping down. And the exercise is not intense enough for all the adrenaline and the stress hormones to push enough glucose out of the liver to keep up. Therefore, we've got a couple of options. We need to either put some extra carbs in here, or reduce the insulin dose here, or maybe a combination of both. Just as a reiteration of the importance of insulin timing, if the exercise is going to be within 90 minutes of the activity, we're going to need to reduce the insulin by maybe 50% or so we don't end up with a situation where we give the full insulin dose, start doing the exercise and require a load of glucose and probably go low in the first place. If we reduce the insulin dose by maybe 50% or so, we certainly will avoid the hypos, but we have to also be mindful we could potentially go a little bit higher. So that's why, if absolute possible, try the 3-hour rule. Make sure your last food and insulin is 3 hours before, therefore you almost take away the effect of exercise supercharging insulin, and you also have the value of all the beautiful nutrients and carbohydrate that you've eaten in your muscles ready to fuel the activity. If the activity is going to be more than 45 minutes, we have to be aware that the liver and the muscles are going to suck more glucose out of the blood, especially if you do exercise in the evening. This will happen overnight. So we need to think about reducing insulin before bed, or potentially having a little snack before bed without any insulin to make sure we don't drop low overnight. So that all sounds complicated, but that's why I've tried to make it easy for you, Grace, Jude and Danny, by putting things into a table that we can work through. So the table, although it may look a little scary at first, is pretty simple. This is the aerobic exercise table. Exercise type, aerobic. This is what we're going to do before exercise, during and after. And we don't need to bother about the red and the yellow, because that'll be for the second time. If we go low the first time, we then follow this the second time. If we go high the first time, we follow this the second time. So we'll start with a starting plan. If the exercise is going to be within 90 minutes, we reduce the insulin dose by half. If it's going to be more than 90 minutes, we don't change it. Basal insulin, obviously, if the exercise is within 90 minutes, there's no point in changing the basal insulin. But if the exercise is going to be more than 90 minutes and you're on a pump, we could reduce the basal insulin by half. You obviously can't do that if you're on injections. The amount of carbs you're going to need, I'll discuss through in a minute, but looking at those charts before, you take on carbs every 20 minutes, a small amount depending on the glucose level and the trend arrow. And then after, if the exercise has been sort of over half an hour, 40 minutes, you need to reduce the insulin by 50% afterwards so that we don't go low afterwards. And if the exercise is sort of near the night time, we can reduce the basal insulin by 20% for 6 hours, or if you're on background insulin, we can reduce it by 20%. So it's pretty straightforward to follow this plan and where to start. Obviously, if you go low the first time you follow this plan, we'll then switch to the red where the insulin reductions are more aggressive. If you go high the first time, we switch where the insulin reductions are less aggressive. It's all a case of trial and error and find out what works for you. So, Grace, I've done an example for you here of what it will look like. Having breakfast at 8 o'clock, 30 grams on a 1:15 ratio, going swimming within that 90 minutes, so at 9 o'clock, weighs 20 kilos and then having 45 grams of carbs afterwards. So following this table here, the exercise is within 90 minutes, therefore reduce the bolus by half. Should have been a 2-unit bolus, so now 1 unit. Check the CGM before and every 20 minutes during, and we'll show how much carbs to have in a second. And then after exercise is finished, what would have been usually a 3-unit bolus for the 45 grams carbs will now be 1.5 units to prevent the hypos. And because the exercise is being done in the morning, there's no need necessarily to reduce the basal insulin because you'll be able to keep an eye on things as the day goes along. How much carbs every 20 minutes? Well, pretty much on this table. As I showed you before, when you put into the calculator, you put what you're doing, how much you weigh. You can then see to check the glucose level 20 minutes before, because if it's on the lower side, we want to bring it up, and then check every 20 minutes, and based on the glucose level and trend arrow, a little top up of glucose. So let's just say 20 minutes before you check the CGM, and you were 4.5 with an arrow across, would have given you 6 grams of carbs, which would have been 2 dextrose, so by the time you started, it would have come up nicely somewhere between 5 and 10. If it had come between, let's say 7.5 an hour across, no carbs for the first 20 minutes, would have checked the CGM after 20 minutes. If it had then dropped down to say 5.5 with an angled arrow down, that would be 8 grams of carbs, 3 dextrose tablets, and that would be good for the next 20 minutes. It's as simple as that. Obviously, it's not going to work perfectly first time, and if you go low the first time, the next time you just switch to the red table and try that. If you go high the first time, you switch to the yellow table and you just try that plan. So this has a little adaptation for you so you can adjust your plans as you go. So summarising that, aerobic and endurance activity generally tends to make the glucose level drop, so we need a plan to prevent that. First thing is we need to think about the timing of the last meal and insulin. If absolutely possible, try to observe the 3-hour rule and don't have insulin food within 3 hours before. But if you are going to have it within 90 minutes, we're looking at a bolus reduction like we did for Grace by half. If the exercise is going to be 45 minutes or more, we need to think about reducing the doses of insulin afterwards, and then obviously making sure you have how much carbs every 20 minutes based on the glucose level and trend arrows. So these will give you a decent starting place. They won't work perfectly, they will require some continual tinkering with trial and error, but now that you understand why things happen and what options you have, you can mess around with these to get the perfect plan for you. Next, we're going to move on to anaerobic exercise, sprinting, high intensity, fast paced exercise.